All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure why we're having technical difficulties, but we'll see if we can get Tim in on this. But good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Week Ahead in txlege. My name is Jeremy Kitchen. I'm the Executive Director of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. We'll be joined hopefully here shortly with our President CEO, Tim Hardin, but want to introduce our special guest, Vance Ginn, Ph.D. economist, president of Ginn Consulting Firm, correct, Vance? So how are you this morning?
Hey, yeah, that's right, Jeremy. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I appreciate you joining us this morning. I know you've been sick this last week, so hopefully
Yeah.
everything is good and you're on the mend.
Yeah, I've got some congestion, so I might have to push mute every once in a while as I cough, but otherwise I'm doing okay.
Well, we appreciate it nonetheless. We'll go ahead and get started here. So the I think the focus of today's episode was going to be kind of a compare and contrast, if you will, of kind of the leading property tax relief proposals that are already making their way through the legislative process. So, of course, we're speaking. Today's episode is on I believe, day 70 of the ongoing legislative session. So that marks officially halfway done of the 140-day total session. We've seen already, we had House Bill 2, which they've dubbed as the Texas Property Tax Relief Act, get a hearing last week in the Texas House Ways and Means Committee. We, of course, saw Senate Bill 3, Senate Bill 4, and Senate Bill 5, which, for lack of a better term, is kind of the prioritized property tax relief package making its way through the Senate. We saw that also get a hearing in the Senate Finance Committee last week. They did vote out officially Senate Bill 4, which we'll talk about. Senate Bill 3 was voted out as well, but has not been put on the calendar yet. And I believe the intent is for Senate Bill 5 to be voted out today in a Senate Finance Committee. Vance, if you don't mind, I know this is a tall order, but maybe do kind of a quick 30,000-foot comparison between all of the approaches thus far.
Yeah, Jeremy. So overall, when you look at the Senate's package, like you said, SB 3, which SB 3 is the homestead exemption increase, from $40,000 to $70,000, so a $30,000 increase there. Um, There's also some changes that happen with 65 and older, where they're also increasing the amount that they will have underneath their homestead exemption as well to try to provide some relief for them. And so you've got a pretty large amount of money going to that. Then you have SB4, which is the compression, along with some changes to the maximum rate that they can set, which also has what's called a collar, which some districts will end up getting more money than others, to try to equalize some of that out there and to reduce some of the Robin Hood. That one's about $5.4 billion towards compression. Then you have Senate Bill 5, which Senate Bill 5 is the personal private property or private personal property, where they're trying to raise some of the credits that go towards that, basically try to reduce some of that tax liability on businesses. That is a Parker bill. The other two are Betancourt bills. And SB5 is about 1.5 billion. And we've got to remember, their overall package in the Senate, they're billing it as $16.5 billion. But out of that 16.5 billion, 5.3 billion is for previous tax relief, in previous sessions. We had 2019, you had HB3, 2021, we had the homestead exemption increase. And so you have some maintaining of those tax relief measures that you've got to continue to pay for over time. So that's the 5.3 billion. So really we're talking about 11.2 billion dollars of quote unquote new relief, right? And then only 5.4 billion of that is going towards new compression, which compression is the gold standard because everyone benefits from that rate compression of reducing those tax rates, whether you have a home or a business or you're a renter, right? Because the landlord's getting that reduction, and ultimately through competition, you'll see that those benefits being passed on to you as well. And so that's really the gold standard. Over in the House, there's $17 billion, which again, 5.3 billion of that is going towards old compression. So it's really about 11.7 billion. But out of their 11.7 billion, all of that's going to compression. So if you look at what the Senate versus the House, the House has about twice as much, more than twice as much, going towards compression. compared to what the Senate has at that $5.4 billion. And so, of course, what we've all been talking a lot about is that the $14.2 billion of 0809 was the last large round of property tax relief. Whenever they came in after a school SCOTUS, the Texas Supreme Court found the school finance system unconstitutional, and that's when they raised or created the margins tax, right? Raised the cigarette tax and some other taxes, the motor vehicle sales tax, to bring in and reduce by about a third that school district maintenance and operation property tax. So that was a way to raise taxes in order to cut other taxes, but didn't turn out so well. Now at least it's just new compression with surplus, but they need to get up to about $20 billion just in inflation adjusted dollars, not to mention what population growth and stuff has been since then, to meet that sort of real record amount. So they've got a long way to go. They've got $32.7 billion in surplus, and even more. They have more than $60 billion in extra revenue if they were able to rein in government spending. So long story short, there's a long way to go. I think there's some good within the Senate package, but there's a lot more they need to do towards compression for us to really feel substantial relief.
I want to hone in on you. You obviously it focused on, I think the approach we've taken obviously is compression is superior. When we talk about the contrasting the House versus the Senate approaches, the Senate leadership specifically seems focused on increasing the homestead exemption, which, as you mentioned, of course, means that only people that qualify for the exemption really benefit from that. And even then, we're hard pressed to say that it's much of a benefit, given if we don't also get, let's say, things like inflation or appraisal creep, reformed or addressed as well, just because in the past, increases to the homestead exemption have primarily been eaten up, right? So any relief we would have seen has kind of fallen to the wayside because of those factors. But of course, you also mentioned, just to kind of summarize it, right, on the House side, they seemingly have kind of prioritized the appraisal cap reform approach, which, to be clear, from a Texans for Fiscal Responsibility perspective, we're not against appraisal reform. We do think it's something that does need to be done, but we certainly think that the best way to take advantage of the historic opportunity that's provided this legislative session, given the 32.6 or $32.7 billion budget surplus, is to use as much, if not all of that, right, to compress, to buy down the property tax overall, and put us on a path to elimination of the tax, which, that's our biggest objection, I think, to the leading proposals, is that neither seem to want to take advantage of that historic opportunity, let alone put us on that path. Would you agree with that?
I would, yeah, and I was, it was an omission on my part, where that's usually where I like to start. So thanks, Jeremy. I mean, I think what I've been saying here recently is we need to stop renting and start owning. We need to start being able to own our property, and as Tim always mentions quite correctly, is that look, the property tax is an immoral tax. It's one that we're not able to own our property. We don't have our God-given right to property and everything else, and we ultimately have to eliminate it in order for us to be able to reap the benefits of our wares, of being able to have that opportunity to own our property, to do what we want with it, instead of renting from the government essentially forever, no matter where we live. And when you look at the House package, that 17 billion, like I said, only 11.7 billion is actual new compression. But then you have these appraisal cap where they're reducing it, right? They're reducing it from 10%. Currently it's 10% for homeowners with a homestead, right? That's your primary source of residence. It's 10%. No one else has a cap. Well, what they're doing is they're passing this along to everyone. So businesses, renters, so apartments, and everyone else would have a cap of 5%. So that sounds good, right, Jeremy? I mean, in general, I think if you ask most people on the street, do you want your cap at 10% or 5%? I think a lot of people would say, yes, give me 5%. The problem is that the devil's in the details, okay? If you start to cap some people, what this does is it creates inequities throughout the property tax system. So you move into your house on one side of the street, and you're set in at the 5%, and so you're limited to how much your growth is in your property tax over time. Somebody else moves across the street, same exact house. 5 years later, they've got to pay the market value and then that new property tax, and then they're limited at 5%. So you're actually getting a benefit on your side of the street that the other person across the street is paying a lot more in property taxes for the same amount of services. That's not an equal system. It's not a quote unquote fair system overall. And what it does, if you look at what happened in Prop 13 in California, they did something very similar to where they limited the growth rate to only 1% per year, which sounds even better, right? But what it does, the research shows in this, is it creates what's called a lock-in effect, where it locks people into their property where they have no incentive to sell. And what that does is it creates less available supply of property on the marketplace and drives all the other prices up, which creates an even worse situation for you over time. Because as we know, right, Jeremy, is that the real problem is government spending. We've really got to focus on government spending. And then if you do that, which we've talked about, spending limits on the local level, Representative Briscoe Cain has a good bill on that. I think if you do something along those lines, we can really get control of spending and therefore taxes, making sure that they go lower, and then making sure they all go down to zero over time with the methods that we've laid out with these buy downs.
Yeah, I think you hit on a few good important points there, right? As we kind of wrap up our topic here for property taxes, we can't talk about these things in a vacuum, and we can't address these, or the legislature can't honestly attempt to address these things if they don't also try to at least address or simultaneously address local government spending. Of course, as we know, as we've said several times, of course, the tax is levied at the local level, right? And so, lawmakers, I think as Tim had indicated last week in a post, he had talked about we're kind of just addressing the symptoms as opposed to addressing the overall disease. And we'll see. Of course, we're only halfway through the legislative session, and we've seen historically session to session that things have changed greatly over that time. But I thought it was important to at least kind of walk through the differences and the varying approaches here in the legislature now that we're halfway through. I'll pivot real quick as we kind of get towards the end of today's episode. I want to remind folks that the House does convene today. The Texas House of Representatives convenes at 2 p.m. today. I believe the Texas Senate convenes at 3 p.m. today. We're going to start to see a ramp up of legislation here over the next few weeks make its way through the committee process, make its way to each individual chamber's floor, and get voted on, and then eventually get sent to the opposite chamber, right? And so I want to implore folks, if you're interested, if you have not already subscribed to our vote notices, you can do that at texastaxpayers.com/subscribe. We send out vote notices to things that could potentially be on our fiscal responsibility index. So make sure to check those out there. I like to pause at the end of every episode here and see if there's any potential questions from anyone that might be listening in. So I'll give it a few seconds. If you're interested in asking a question, please make sure to request as much through Twitter Spaces. Keep your question short and brief, please, and we'll try to get to it. So I'll pause for 1 second here. Okay, awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and end today's episode. Remind folks, we do have our weekly wrap-up podcast, Taxpayer Talks, that gets published on Thursdays. You can find that on our website, texastaxpayers.com, or your favorite podcast provider, if you will. And then, of course, we will be back next Monday with another episode of the week ahead. Vance, appreciate you joining us this morning. Tim, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Y'all have a good weekend.
Hey, you made it to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that way you're notified next time we post a video and update to the channel. Thanks again.